In this interview, join us as we delve into the intricacies of Japan's relations with Korea, analyzing the significance of their first presidential summit in 12 years. Witness the escalating hostility from China, Russia, and North Korea, and explore Japan's commitment to defending Taiwan amidst Xi Jinping's blackmail tactics towards Okinawa. Discover the crucial role of Japanese shipyards in global logistics, maintenance, and arms production. Uncover the implications of NATO's liaison office in Japan and the strategic presence of France, Germany, and Italy in the Pacific. Don't miss out on the upcoming EU-Japan summit and its potential impact on international relations.
Hi everyone, today we have a very interesting guest from Japan. It's Ken Moriyasu, a diplomatic correspondent in Japan. Welcome to the show. And you're currently in Japan, but as you just told me, you're soon moving back to Washington, yes?
Yes, it'll be the first time in 18 years to work in Washington.
Great, okay. Will be fantastic, I guess. I would like to ask you about few topics like recent events that we could discuss now. The first one I would like to ask you is the Thaw, the relationships between Japan and Korea. We had a first presidential summit, first in 12 years recently. So I wanted to ask you, how strong is it? Are there any problems? Because as we know, the Chinese ambassador in Seoul, he recently challenged this relationship, and he was saying that Seoul should be more, cautious, and that actually the people don't really want this kind of cooperation with Japan, maybe US. So it seems like Chinese authorities are trying to get into this relationship and prevent it from happening. What's your take on that?
Right. Everything happened because of the decisions by the new South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol. I think he looked at the landscape and realized that he had a choice to make: either continue down this neutral path of not alienating China, not alienating America, or to take a clear path to be with the West based on the shared values. And traditionally, South Korean diplomats preferred the first option of being neutral. This is because South Korea's number one priority is how to deal with North Korea. And when it comes to dealing with North Korea, China is a partner in that endeavor, not a rival or somebody you should pressure, because all of the food, the commodities, all the trade goes through China regarding North Korea, and China does have leverage. And I think South Korea's position was always that it's better to have good relations with China so that China would help in South Korea's aim of managing relations with North Korea. I think they came to the conclusion that China is probably not going to help South Korea in the way that South Korea wants, however neutral their stance is, and that they looked at the world kind of uniting around America in terms of the US-China tensions, and decided that it was very difficult to stay in the middle ground, and that they needed to switch sides. This came very at a good opportunity for Prime Minister Kishida, because in the days of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, Japan's strategy was to prevent a three-front crisis, not to have a crisis with China, not to have a crisis with North Korea, and not have a crisis with Russia at the same time. But with the Ukraine war, it became difficult to have relations with Russia. So Japan was faced with this three-front crisis, and then with nothing else to do to improve these three alleyways, one thing he could do for Kishida was to mend relations with South Korea. South Korea, of course, is not an enemy, but at least we can strengthen our relationship with our friends. That's what Kishida wanted, and Yoon Suk-yeol's approach came at this opportune time, and that's why they both made a very strategic decision to try to improve ties. And to answer your question of what is the concern here? How does Japan make it stick? The biggest concern, of course, is that if there is a regime change in South Korea and the opposition comes to power, the opposition takes a much more harsher stance on Japan and the history between the two countries. And bashing Japan, of course, is a very attractive card for politicians in South Korea. If they go back to that path, all of this falls apart. So the challenge for Japan is to put in place tangible results for South Korea within the next 4 years, so that the South Koreans wouldn't want to choose a different path. And of course, one of those things, I think, would be inviting South Korea into the Quad. By doing so, South Korea would not just be accountable to Japan, but also to the US and to Australia and to India. If it wants to take a different foreign policy and start attacking Japan, they would have to explain to America, Australia, and India as well why they think this is a good idea.
And I think that this policy is aligned with the general populace attitude, because the attitude to China is changing. And I think both Japanese and Korean citizens probably also want a bit more cautious approach, right?
Yeah, my wife is Korean.
Okay.
She has mixed feelings towards Japan, of course, in terms of history. But if you ask her if she shares values with the West or China, of course she's not going to say she shares the values with China. She wants a free, democratic lifestyle, and so that's not a difficult choice for her. And I think it's the same for most young Koreans.
Yeah, of course, it's also similar in Taiwan. The younger the citizens are, the more indifferent are they to China. Good, thank you. The next question would be, we could say that, everybody knows Taiwan is facing a lot of hostility and challenges from the Chinese government, but we might actually say that Japan might even face more, because actually it has 3 hostile neighbors, all dictatorships. So it faces hostility from both China and Russia and North Korea. So I wanted to ask, since Japanese authorities said that Taiwan's security is also Japan's security, how committed is Japan to Taiwan's defense? Because we see, a lot of contacts becoming closer, both militarily and now politically. The Taiwanese vice prime minister being now in Japan. So could you please talk a little bit about that, about this the relationship becoming officially closer and better between both countries?
Well, I think we have to be a little pragmatic here. Japan's national security is 100% dependent on its relationship with America, and Japan's commitment to Taiwan only becomes important in this aspect. So, if Japan is going to help out in the Taiwan crisis, it's not because Japan likes Taiwan or loves Taiwan, but it's because it needs to help the Americans, or show the Americans that it's ready to help, so that America is committed to Japan's security as well. Going back to what we were discussing previously about Japan's tensions with its neighbors, as you say, Japan has a problem that bad relations with China, bad relations with North Korea, bad relations with Russia. And this is the 3-front crisis that Abe wanted to avoid. That's why Abe made a strategic decision to reach out to Vladimir Putin and to establish a relationship with him. He met Putin 27 times when he was in office. But now that is no longer a viable option after the Ukrainian war. I think the thinking has changed inside the Japanese government. Instead of trying to reduce the fronts that Japan faces, I think the new idea is, how can we create more fronts for our adversaries, especially China? And one of the ways to do that is to have a great relationship with India, because India and China have tensions on their border. Japan and America don't need India to join the battle in the Taiwan Strait if there's a crisis. But if India could be strong on its border, China would naturally have to worry about India as well. And that might make China hesitate. Also, there could be similar thinking with South Korea. If South Korea and America are strong on the Korean Peninsula, China might have to worry about that. And if America and Australia are strong in the South Pacific or the South China Sea, that creates a fourth front for China. So I think the new thinking is how do we complicate the strategy for Chinese war planners? Because the worst thing is to make it a slam dunk, easy, a winnable plan for the Chinese war planners. If it's complicated, they'll think maybe not today. And that's the whole point of the strategy.
As we know, Xi Jinping recently visited a museum, and then he mentioned, Okinawa being in a tributary relationship hundreds of years ago towards China. Is he in this way pushing back and threatening Japan, don't go this way, don't align, don't cooperate, because we might then revive the issue of Okinawa being Chinese? How do you see this development?
Oh yeah, this is this is what everybody fears in Japan.
Yes.
The whole point of the Senkaku Islands is not necessarily because of the rocks in the Senkaku itself, but because the Japanese believe that if China invades Taiwan on a Tuesday, it's going to come after the Senkakus on Wednesday, and they're going to come for the Okinawa on Thursday. So that's why this is, the fear that most Japanese planners have, and by like just touching on that, Xi Jinping has very effectively like what's the in Japanese there's a word that you anger the beehive, so everyone gets worried. So I think that has an effect like that. I don't know if he's serious or that it really, I can't imagine China taking Okinawa, but just the thought of it and his raising it is very politically effective, I think.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
Yeah, it follows usually the same pattern. Like this is what the Chinese government always tries to do: mention a topic, bring it up again, then include it in negotiations and make it then relevant. So the other side has to take a stance. So I think this is what they are doing, just probing how far they can go, right?
Yeah, and also China doesn't want to fight. They want to win without fighting. So this psychological warfare is what they prefer to actual battle, because they haven't really had a war in decades, and that didn't go well the last time they tried.
Good. Next topic I would like to ask you is about more practical issues, not so publicized in the media, like Japanese shipyards becoming the logistic hub and backyard for U.S. Ships for the maintenance. Also, for the F-35 A and B fighter jets should be repaired in Japan. Then we have another issue, the arms production might be standardized for both US and Europe, the one manufactured in Japan, because of the rising maintenance costs. And also, additionally, the US is also discussing with India to become a naval logistics hub. So could you maybe elaborate on this? How relevant is it? Because I think it's a good development. It shows that it's really a bit more substance because behind the more, well-known occurrences.
Yeah, helping logistics, like deepening the relationship through logistics, is very important, and it's also less controversial for India and for Japan to deepen cooperation with the US. It comes from a fear on the US side that China has great shipbuilding capability and maintenance capability, while the US does not have a really good ship constructing
Yes.
capability, and the maintenance is very much behind. Because after the Cold War, there was a period when, in the name of the peace dividend, the American leadership thought that now is an era of peace. We can reduce our defense budget and use that for education and social security. Therefore, the shipyards were closed. There was like 10 or 9 public shipyards. Now that's down to 4. And those 4 have dry docks that are all 100 years old. And here, they are so limited in their capability that the public shipyards are used solely for nuclear aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. So the construction and the maintenance of the regular non-nuclear surface ships are all um, handled by private shipyards in America. But those private shipyards have been reducing the workforce, and especially during COVID, they had to lay off a lot of staff, and it's very difficult for them to hire more people without the clarity, because um, they might. I mean, the difference between building 2 ships a year and 3 ships a year is billions of dollars and hundreds of people. But if the Navy decides to go back to 2 ships a year, then they have to lay off people again. So without that clarity, it's very difficult for shipyards to increase its workforce. Meanwhile, in Japan, there are lots of shipyards and lots of shipbuilding capability. Japan used to be one of the top shipbuilders in the world, but since then they have been overtaken by China and South Korea. If there could be more work for these shipyards, that's a win-win for both sides. Japan could provide the required maintenance and ultimately shipbuilding for the American Navy, and it would also give constant work for the Japanese shipyards. And for India, India really, through its non-aligned history, doesn't really want to have an alliance with the US. But of course, it's so worried about China, it really needs. Um, it's in a kind of dilemma because it wants to be part of the alliance, but it really doesn't want to be a treaty ally. By offering maintenance in these 3 shipyards, um, 2 on the west coast of India, 1 on the east coast of India, where American ships can maintain their ships mid-voyage. This is really going to help the US Navy, and it will be a counter to the so-called string of pearls ports that China is building all around India, such as Djibouti or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. So this is the logistics battle, the tug of war that's taking place, and I think this is going to be one of the focuses of the US-Japan alliance in the coming months.
Yeah, we saw those problems also with the AUKUS alliance, where the Australians have to help both financially and those submarines. There is a problem where to construct them, who should build them, because there is not enough staff, not enough money, not enough docks. So we have the same issue here with AUKUS.
Yeah, the AUKUS was a very bold idea, it was a brilliant idea, but the logistics just couldn't keep up.
Yes.
So what is going to happen is that the Americans, the British, and the Australians have a trilateral pact, but America
Yes.
really is taking part in the AUKUS. AUKUS is between Australia and the UK. The Americans have said first they would start sending more of their Virginia class submarines
Yes.
to Australia on a rotation
Yes.
basis. That's fine, and then they will sell a few Virginia class submarines to Australia. They've said, but whether those are newly built or second hand or that is not clear yet, and it's going to be very difficult without the significant investment in American shipyards to add like new submarines to the construction without hurting America's already strained plans.
Not only in Australia, they would also dock one now in South Korea, right?
Oh, this is a visit of the SSBN.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Mhm. This is a
Okay, so
one-time.
it's just temporary. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Good.
it's interesting because that submarine that is going to go to South Korea is a so-called SSBN with a nuclear
Yes.
strategic missile. Whether the submarine will actually have the missiles or just pretend to have the missiles is very secretive. Nobody knows.
Good. One more topic I wanted to ask you about the NATO liaison office in Japan. Could you please elaborate a little bit about that? Because that was just the news in the media, but we don't really know what's going on in the background. How is the development? What's really going on there?
Right. So last May, at the NATO summit, was it May or June? Last year, the 4 Asian Pacific partners of NATO Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Those leaders attended the NATO summit in Madrid for the first time.
Yes.
This year, next month in July, in Vilnius, in Lithuania, the four leaders will once again take part in the NATO summit. And there has been this growing, deepening engagement between NATO and the AP4, the Asia Pacific Four Partners. This is related to a document that NATO came up with last year, the strategic concept, in which it mentioned China for the first time as one of the challenges that NATO faces. Until now, NATO was predominantly focused on Russia, but in the strategic concept of 2022, they said that China is a challenge, the future challenge, the way that China behaves in the world, the way it tries to project its strength and it coerce people through economy, that poses a threat to NATO, and also through new means like cyber or outer space. Um, Inevitably, the actions of China will impact NATO, and that kind of new threat transcends traditional geography. And while NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the threats that are coming out of China have nothing to do with the Atlantic. They are global or even universal, including outer space. So that's why NATO has been trying to understand China better. And to understand China better, NATO thinks that it's better to have a relationship with these four partners: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And when in January, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg came to Japan, and he had discussions with Kishida, and from then there was started to be a discussion both ways for NATO to build a liaison office in Tokyo to coordinate policies and to gather information, the latest information about China and Russia from Tokyo. And on Japan's part, it decided to split up the Brussels embassy, the Japanese embassy in Brussels, where the ambassador, Mikami-san, was the ambassador to Brussels, but also the NATO ambassador. They're going to have two ambassadors there, one new ambassador focused on NATO. So
Okay.
these were the reciprocal movements. But since then, it has been reported that France, especially President Macron, is not so keen on this NATO office. The reasons could be that Stoltenberg proceeded with this without consulting allies enough, and also that this projected office will be one person with one computer. So regarding the benefits that it could bring, Macron thinks that it sends out too much of a negative message to countries like China, which will become very worried. So he's questioning whether this is worth the fuss. For Japan, having this NATO office is very important. Very important because whatever NATO information gathers and reports to the NATO headquarters, that information will come through Tokyo, meaning that it will very much have a Tokyo lens or a Tokyo bias, which is very favorable for Japan.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
But would it really be just one person with one computer, or maybe over time, maybe that's just the beginning, and in a year or two, maybe there would be like a real office with people, analysts?
Yes. So what is happening right now is that because NATO doesn't have a liaison office in Tokyo, the Danish embassy, the embassy of Denmark, is acting as the contact point of NATO. And in the Danish embassy, there are four officials who handle the NATO file. So, but the Danish tell me having four people as the contact point is very different from the liaison office, because the Danish embassy are not the representatives of NATO. They can listen to what the Japanese say and report back, but they cannot speak on behalf of NATO. The NATO liaison office may start with one person, one computer, but they will come with the full backing of the NATO organization.
Okay.
When the person speaks to the Japanese government, he or she will speak on behalf of NATO, and whatever is told to he or her will be fed back through the official NATO channel, and the entire NATO secretariat will be on the receiving side. So it's very, very different from what we have now.
Good, that's NATO, but Ursula von der Leyen, she also spoke recently about the importance of security cooperation with Japan. We will have on July 13th the 29th EU-Japan summit in Brussels. And that seems also to gain importance. So it looks like Japan is really, more and more important for the West, both EU and the US, in terms of helping them with the security and, as you say, having the lens on Asia. So it looks like really Japanese role is constantly increasing, which probably doesn't make China happy.
Right. This Europe visit is very interesting in terms of the competition with China, because I think for Xi Jinping, the number one priority, one of the number one priorities right now, is to rebuild ties with Europe, because before Biden came into office, the EU and China had kind of agreed on an investment pact, but
Yes.
that has really not proceeded. Um, and I think China wants to put that back on track. And receiving Blinken in Beijing last week was partly to send a message to Europe. Look, America and China are talking again. Now it's time for you to come back to talk to us again. So this is very important for Europe, and for Kishida to go to the EU and remind the Europeans that China may have different plans. China is trying to create this new scary world order. This will be very troubling for China. I think Beijing would like Kishida not to go. So in that aspect, it will be a very silent tug of war between Japan and China in the EU.
Okay, since we are at the EU Asian cooperation, so France, Germany, and recently Italy are sending their ships to the Indo-Pacific. The Italian one even docked in Yokosuka. Does it make any difference that the EU sends few ships to Asia? I mean, for China, that probably doesn't keep, Xi Jinping awake at night. There's just few ships, and he knows Europe doesn't have really any serious army and naval capabilities. So what's the relevance of such a behavior? Doesn't really do much.
Yeah, in terms of like military assets compared to the American military force, um, the Europeans, as you say, one by one, really aren't something for Xi Jinping to stay up at night. But of course, I think like if you look at Ukraine and you could look at Afghanistan, Afghanistan was a worst case scenario for America because they were basically on their own. And if America is on their own, it's very difficult for the American public to support that operation. So most of American people wanted Biden to leave Afghanistan. So that's why, even though America is militarily superior to the Taliban, it had a lot of difficulty to sustain the fight in Afghanistan. Ukraine is a very different picture because the whole of NATO, the whole of the world is behind Ukraine. And in such a scenario, it's very easy for Biden to sell the case to the American public. We need to help Ukraine. So the fact that France, the UK, Germany, Italy are all kind of sending their assets to the Indo-Pacific, this is very good for Japan in that it kind of encourages America to focus on the Indo-Pacific. And as a collective whole, that works as a deterrence against China. So in that sense, I think it is a very important development.
Also, it shows probably that if not militarily, then maybe EU could back up US sanctions, or maybe could somehow get involved with the NATO, with the US.
Yeah, when it was reported that Macron is opposed to the NATO liaison office that week, the same week, there was a French frigate passing through the
Yes,
Taiwan
yes,
Straits.
yes.
So, like being committed to the Indo-Pacific through these military engagements, kind of like um, that becomes a break for Macron to go too far in reaching out to China, because he has to have consistency in the narrative. Why are you sending your ship in the Taiwan Strait when you want to be friends with China so much, right?
Good. Thank you very much, Ken, for your time. Maybe just one more question. Is there anything that you would like to mention or discuss, something you're working now on, maybe something you're researching, like an interesting topic that we don't know yet, or maybe that you would be dealing with in Washington, something that, nobody knows?
Well, I don't want to disclose all my stories that I'm going to pursue, but one of
No,
the
really,
things that
something interesting from Japan or Asia that is really, you think it's more relevant, but not so much mentioned in the mainstream media.
Well, one of the things I'm looking forward to is
Yes.
visiting the National Archives in Washington
Okay.
and the Library of Congress, um, because when the World War II ended, the Americans took a lot of books from Japan, took
Okay.
books from Manchuria, where Japan had amassed tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of books. But the Americans thought these were propaganda items and they were dangerous for the psyche. So they confiscated all the books and took it to America.
Okay. Wow.
And those books, tens of thousands of books, are still in the Library of Congress in Washington. The US has returned some books to Japan, and several thousand of these books are in Ichigaya in Tokyo in the Ministry of Defense think tank library. But there are still tens of thousands of books left in the Library of Congress, so I look forward to researching what kind of documents and books are still there and whether there are any plans to return them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, Ken. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.